Welcome everyone to the Global Disability Inclusion webinar, the Employee Experience and Disability Inclusion, understanding 15 to 20% of your employee population. Your speakers for today's program are Meg O'Connell, founder and CEO of Global Disability Inclusion, and Peter Rutigliano, PhD, Senior Principal at Mercer. Audiocast quality is subject to your equipment, available bandwidth, and internet traffic. If you experience unsatisfactory audio quality, please use the telephone dial-in option provided in your confirmation and reminder emails. If you have dialed in, operator assistance is available by pressing #. You can send questions at any time by using the Q&A box to the left of the presentation screen. That's the one with the question mark. Just type your message at the bottom of the pop-up box and press enter to send it. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. And now I will turn the call over to our speakers. Please begin.
Thank you, Luke. We appreciate your help. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Pete Rutigliano and I are excited to be here and share this topic with you. We have been studying disability employee engagement data for 10 plus years and have some really interesting findings. So we'll jump right in. As Luke said, I'm Meg O'Connell. I'm the CEO and founder of Global Disability Inclusion, and we help companies expand their diversity initiatives to include people with disabilities. Pete, you want to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Pete Rutigliano. I work with Mercer. I've been doing this kind of engagement work now for, I guess, about 25 years, but a lot of my research area is in employees with disabilities, and you'll be able to see some of the work we've done here and some of our research and data we've collected over the years. So I'm looking forward to this. Meg?
Great. Thanks, Pete. And we are happy to take questions throughout. So if you guys want to send anything in the chat, we'll be watching that. Certainly want this to be as much of a dialogue as possible. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right. This is for those that may not be familiar with engagement surveys and their purpose and why. Though I imagine if you're joining this call, you know some of this already. But for those that may be new to the topic, engagement surveys really are a powerful tool that companies use to assess their workplace programs, to really understand how their policies, programs, and procedures impact various groups within their company. It also drives strategy and development. We know in the engagement work that we do that companies identify gaps in what they're doing around, again, policies, programs, procedures, their climate and culture, and they put together, 3 to 5 year plans around what comes out of these engagement surveys. So they're a really powerful tool for driving change within an organization and for an organization to really understand their health and how satisfied and happy their employees are. It's also a great opportunity for some benchmarks to know where peers are, how you compare to your competitors, and just how you're faring in your industry overall. And then finally, the employee experience. We know employees aren't always great about open, honest feedback. They're worried about being viewed as complaining or negative, or they're just worried about consequences for speaking up. So an anonymous survey is a great tool for capturing the real data or the real thoughts and perceptions of employees with and without disabilities.
Yep. Actually, Meg, before you continue, just real quick, one thing I do want to point out that's been real interesting over the last year or two is because we're collecting data on a regular basis, we were able to recognize what the impact of COVID was to the employee bases of various companies. And that has been real critical information. When people are talking about there's been so much turnover going on in 2020 and 2021, well, we've been able to provide that data. And it's because of this continuing surveying year over year that we've been able to see that pattern, and that's been really critical over the last year or two.
It's an excellent point.
Meg, back to you.
All right. So one of the things, Pete and I have started studying disability employee engagement data, 2006, and was our first pass at it. And we realized there was an opportunity for some real trends and information here, because as we looked at the Mercer Global Database, we found that 90% of companies explore gender differences as a diversity demographic, 75% explore race and ethnicity, but only 4% of companies even investigate disability as a diversity segment. So this is a massive miss for most organizations. We know people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the world. It is 15% of the global population. In the US alone, it is 26% of the population. So we know that people with disabilities are 15 to 20% of an employee population. So the largest minority group is getting the least focus by corporate America or corporations around the globe.
And I'm going to add to that what we've been seeing. Yeah, we've been seeing this pattern over the last couple of years, actually mostly because of some of the social injustices that we saw in 2020. Now we're starting to see a lot more companies being interested in studying diversity, and happily, more companies are starting to add disability as part of that. But what's really interesting is we're seeing that trend not just in United States and Canada, but we're also starting to see a bigger push toward that now in Europe and APAC. So this is not just a United States or North American phenomenon. We're actually nationally seeing it around the world, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
So
Pete, you want to take us through this?
Yeah, sure. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the data. So just to give you an idea, this represents over 10 years of data that we've been studying across many, many different companies around the world. And when I first started analyzing this, I was really surprised at some of the differences I was seeing. In fact, one of the biggest differences that we saw is this question on the left-hand side. I have the freedom to use my judgment in getting my job done. We saw a 13% difference between employees with disabilities in green and employees without disabilities in blue. That was a real big difference, and it was very much a surprise for me, right? They don't feel like they have the job latitude that normally you would expect to see. On the right-hand side, we see also a little bit deeper in this. Employees can express their ideas and views without negative consequences. There is something about the environment that makes it such that people without disabilities are performing much higher. So our average is around 69% here, but we're only seeing 57% for employees with disabilities. That is a real big difference, right? So we dug a little bit deeper into this, and moving on to the next slide. We saw this consistency was pretty much across the board. When we looked at, let's say, what is my relationship with management and what is my relationship with the company overall, we saw pretty big differences there. So in this one, I receive recognition from management when I do a good job. There's a 12% difference between employees with disabilities and those without. And then on the right-hand side, my company takes an interest in the well-being of its employees, right? This is how I perceive my relationship with my company. And we saw a 9% difference between those with disabilities and those without. These are some really stark differences that we're seeing pretty much across the board. Now, one thing that's real interesting about this is we see a greater difference when it's a more distal relationship. So in other words, my relationship to my company versus my relationship to management, right? We saw much greater differences there. Meg, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, this, being in this space, I wasn't terribly surprised that the numbers would be lower, but I was shocked at the size of the gap, and that these are two pivotal things that companies look at. How are you being treated by your managers? And do you feel that the company cares about you? And so these big gaps point to two big drivers that lead
Right.
people to leave, lead people to be dissatisfied, lead people to feel if there's another opportunity that comes my way, I'm going to take it because my manager doesn't care about me and my company doesn't care about me. So, you know, these are really important data points, and companies spend a lot of time really reviewing, analyzing what are the gaps and why are there.
Yep. And I do want to point out to people, we're only showing a handful of questions, right? I mean, we're only going to be showing here 8 questions. My database was full. I think I had 80 questions total that show these differences. We're just showing you some of the key themes we're seeing. I had a lot more examples of questions where, you know, my relationship with management or leadership show those big gaps.
Yeah,
but then we want to drill down.
We're giving you the high here. I'm sorry, Pete, you were trying to say something?
No, it's okay. Keep going.
Okay. So we did see a few instances where the numbers were smaller, that, you know, we weren't seeing the 13, 14 percentage point gaps. So the chart on the right says, I feel my career goals can be met at my company, and employees with without disabilities were at 71%, and employees with disabilities were at 64%. So people with disabilities aren't feeling that they can meet their career goals. A lot of times we hear from employees with disabilities that they get pigeonholed into the role that they entered the company at, and they get stuck there, and they're not being viewed for advancement opportunities or other professional development opportunities within the company. So we know that this is a gap, and definitely something companies need to focus on. And then to the right, my company created an environment where people of diverse backgrounds can succeed. Again, 85% points for employees without disability and 77 for those with disabilities. So an 8 percentage point difference. So again, when we're talking about diverse backgrounds, people interpret that to whatever their diverse background is. So we know people with disabilities are identifying themselves as that when they're completing this questionnaire. So again, we've got folks feeling they can't achieve their goals, and that another instance of my company doesn't really care about me. It doesn't want me to succeed as a person with a disability. Pete, what do you want to add?
Adding to that, I feel my career goals can be met at this company. That this really measures 2 distinct things. One, it measures just simply, do I feel like there are opportunities above what I'm doing now? But there's the other side of it, which is less obvious, which is, do I want to stay in this company? Or do I want to look for opportunities outside of this company? And this is where you start seeing a little bit of that dissatisfaction. And in fact, we see those differences on engagement scores. That employees with disabilities do not feel that level of connection with their organization that we really want to see. And we know that this is incredibly important. The more people feel connected with their organization, the harder they work, the more conscientious they are, the better customer service, the more they'll bring their whole self to work so that I can be innovative in my job and come up with great ideas. These are all really incredibly important metrics that really make for a better employee experience, but also benefits for the company overall.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. The first one says, could it also be that people with disabilities have a harder time finding a job, so they don't want to make waves so they can keep their jobs? Absolutely. And we hear that all the time from people with disabilities. I don't want to complain. I don't want to raise my hand. I don't, I'm happy I have a job because, you know, we know in most instances, it takes people with disabilities, 3 to 5 times as long to find a job, and in some cases much longer than that. So they don't want to make waves. They're not going to rock the boat by, being dissatisfied or talking about, my manager isn't recognizing me, because they're happy to be employed because it's taken them so long.
Right.
Next question, do you have any data on the percentage of people with disabilities that are unemployed? you can find that. We don't have that as part of this study, which is what we're focusing on today. So if you're in the U.S., the Department of Labor, the Office of Disability Employee Policy has ODEP, Office of Disability Employment Policy, yes, has that data on their website, so you can find that there. I know other governmental agencies around the globe keep that data as well too. The UN has data as well as the International Labor Organization, so those are additional resources for you as well. One more question. Is there data on employees with disabilities feeling more connection if the employer offers benefits that are tailored to those with disabilities? Pete, you're my data guru. Have you seen anything on that?
Yes, absolutely. So we find that the more employees with disabilities feel that the organization is thinking about their group, that they feel like they've reached out, that they value them more, that they recognize the importance they bring to the table, the better the scores are. So if we are working in an organization where we'll have specific benefits that will target people with disabilities and give some benefits to them, it'll make them feel a lot more valued in the organization. Now, one side thing about it, because it's benefits, one of the issues around that is employees with disabilities is such a heterogeneous group that it's very difficult to come up with benefit plans that are really targeted that way. But any way they can help support it, and employees with disabilities feel like, you know what, they're extending an olive branch, they're trying to do the best they can, the more valued they feel. Meg, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I'm in the middle of writing an article right now talking about disability workplace disruptors that should come out in a couple of weeks. And it's about the emerging policies that we're seeing that I think in part were driven by COVID-19 and the things that we're seeing companies create in benefits that they have not previously created. One good example is caregiver benefits. This one company I'm working with offers 2 weeks of caregiver benefits in addition to what your regular PTO is. So this is groundbreaking. And what's so awesome about it, you can take it by the hour. So if you have a sick child and you need to go pick them up at school and bring them home, or you have doctor's appointments or things that will take up time out of your workday, you can take those benefits. And so we're seeing that that works for everybody, right? That's not just people with disabilities that need care. It's parents. It's the sandwich generation that are taking care of aging parents and also children. You know, we all have busy lives. So we're seeing new ways of benefits emerging. Of course, we know hybrid working is going to be the new approach, and that's a great thing for people with disabilities. So we're going to continue to see the emergence of policies that were originally created for people with disabilities that actually work for everybody else. And we know that if you design for disability, you're actually designing for everybody because everybody uses those benefits too. So stay tuned on that. We're going to continue to see a rise in more benefits for people with disabilities.
Absolutely. And I will also say there's a growing trend to have benefits being more specific to different populations, that try not to just make one blanket that works for everyone, come up with different things and their benefits that will attract different crowds. So I definitely expect to see more things coming out in that direction.
That's great. It's so great. You know, COVID was a lot of things, but it really has what's the word I'm looking for? Change the way companies are viewing their workplace policies, their interactions with their employees, how to engage them differently, how to support them differently. So it really has kind of radicalized the approach that we have had. And companies expected one size fits all model for many years, and we have seen that that doesn't work for everybody anymore. So companies are having to adjust. So this next slide, I see a couple more questions came in. So let me get through this slide, and we'll pause and get to those quickly. This is another slide that we're giving you two of the ones with the biggest difference and two of the ones with the smallest differences. So the first on the left is untreated with respect and dignity, 89% for people without disabilities and 84% people with disabilities. You know, this is a little bit of a head scratcher, right? Because of some of the other things that, like, my manager doesn't recognize me, I don't feel my employee, my company is, you know, considers my well-being in the workplace, you know, but they do feel like they're treated with dignity and respect. And, you know, when we looked at this further, we know that people with disabilities within their immediate teams feel valued and feel respected. It's as those gaps get farther and farther between other departments, between leadership, that's where we start seeing the disconnect. But we know people with disabilities do feel valued and respected within their teams because they're able to demonstrate that they can contribute. Next one, the amount of work expected of me is reasonable. Only a 6 percentage point difference here, 70% those without disabilities and 64% those with disabilities. So good news here, especially when we know everybody feels extremely overloaded and overrun, that people feel that, you know, the work required of them is acceptable. So let me go to a couple of questions. We got somebody that says the image is not showing. So Luke, I don't know if you can help us with that. Please go ahead and reload your browser, says Luke. Thank you, Luke. When asking these questions, collecting this data, what was the sample size? Also, do we have any S? I don't know what that means. So want to talk about sample size?
Yeah, so we've been collecting these data for about 10 years now, and our disabled group represents around 300,000 people, and our overall data set is just for where we have differences between those with disabilities and those without, is I think about 1.4 million, but this comes from a larger data set of about 12 million employee records. From what I've heard, this is outside of the U.S. Census. This is one of the largest databases of scores, employee scores for employees with disabilities versus those without. So it's quite a robust data set that we're talking here.
Yeah,
and
it's been a labor.
Mostly North America with some people outside in Europe as well.
So we've got a question here. Is there research that makes the connection between increased inclusion and impact to the bottom line? You want to take that, Pete?
Yeah, so there has been some data to show this. And it's been over the last, I'd say last 20 years, we've been able to show that. Most of the data reports that the more people feel connected and feel like they belong in their organization, that is, they can be their authentic self. When we look at those results, those people who feel that connection tend to have better engagement scores and therefore also better outcome to the overall company line, and that I'll be more likely to give my whole self to the organization, then be motivated to go up and beyond and help the company be more successful, and then have better customer satisfaction scores. So all of these factors have really joined together to create a better experience, not only for the employee, but also for the employer as well.
Yeah, yeah. And then we've got a question about business resource groups. What's the best way for disability-focused business resource groups to help improve engagement for colleagues with disabilities? Is there one area of focus that should be a priority? We could do an entire webinar on business resource groups, and I've got personal knowledge of that. Those of you that know me know I worked for Booz Allen Hamilton for 10 years, and I ran their employee resource group for 4.5 of those years. So certainly understand the challenges that happen in creating engagement and prioritization. I wish I had the silver bullet to say this is what every organization should be focusing on. I think the priority depends on where there are gaps within your organization. We have been hearing and hear about in a minute, Pete and I have worked to create the first disability climate culture survey. And we are getting a lot of employee resource groups reaching out to us saying, we want our company to take this survey so they understand how employees with disabilities feel, but we'll get to that in a minute. But certainly, it says the question was by anonymous. So if you're not afraid to be anonymous or you want to be anonymous, you don't mind being anonymous or whatever the word is, you can email me at meg@globaldisabilityinclusion.com, and I'm happy to have an offline conversation about whatever you got going on and how we might give you some advice and counsel.
Yeah.
All right.
So, Meg, so after I've presented these data, I frequently get the question, it's like, well, is that a big deal? Is 5 points or 6 points a problem? And yes, by all means, 5 percentage points on an engagement survey is considered a call to action. And you've seen some of these scores are in the double digits. They're definitely areas that need to be attended to. But this is what's going to surprise people the most. When I look at overall engagement scores, like we said before, we see big differences between those people who are disabled versus those who identify as not being disabled. On average, we're seeing about a 6% difference here. Well, do we see this difference in other areas? Well, what's real interesting is when I looked across that same database of, just under 2 million records overall, I do not see any notable difference in age. I do not see any notable difference in race. And by the way, so let me rephrase that. I do not see a difference between people who are Black, people who are white, people who are Latino, people who are Asian. I do not see a 5 or 6 percentage point difference. In fact, when I look across my entire database, looking at engagement overall, I see no notable differences, maybe 1 point difference between those groups. I typically don't see major differences by gender. And this is also interesting. When I look at sexual orientation, right, when I look at heterosexual versus homosexual populations, I do not see a 5% difference points. In fact, the last time I looked at it for this data set, it was around 1%. Yet I'm seeing a 6 percentage point difference for those who identify as disabled versus those who are not. And that is a huge, huge difference. Now, by the way, before I get people sending messages, no, that's not true, you'll find differences in elsewhere. Do I find differences elsewhere in my data set between gender, between sexual orientation, between race? Absolutely, right? I definitely see some differences there. But when I look at overall engagement, the biggest difference is always disability status. And again, it's the largest diversity group. And then when I think about what kind of impact we can make if we attack this problem and really figure out how do we get it so that people still feel the love from their organization and they feel more of a connection there, what of a huge impact would this have across the board? In fact, let's move on to the next slide.
Yeah, we're getting some more questions too, Pete. So let me advance us and then we'll take some more questions in a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. So one question, and this is really sort of let me level set things for people. The typical question I get from people is, well, wait a minute, Pete, you're finding these differences, but let's face it, it's harder being disabled than it is not being disabled, right? They have harder lives. I'm in a wheelchair, I have a hearing problem, I have a sight problem, I have psychological issues that get into the way, I have medications I can take. It's a harder life that people are living. Of course their scores are going to be lower. Well, what's interesting about that is in order to investigate those differences, what I did is I looked at new hired employees who were hired with a disability versus those who are hired without a disability. And what's real interesting is I didn't really find any true notable differences between those with disabilities and those without disabilities for new hires. But over time, what we saw is those with disabilities, everyone decreases in overall engagement. That's just what happens but we found that those with disabilities decreased at a greater rate than those without disabilities. And that's really where the difference came. It was about the culture and climate that the company had there, that it didn't include them. It didn't make them feel valued. And quite frankly, when people talked about their diversity program, very few times do they mention disability status as part of that equation. We're starting to get a little bit more of an uptake on that now. But historically, that's been, disability status has been the forgotten diversity group. And I do want to, let me attend to that one question. Is our research, did you address this issue for invisible disabilities? That is a real interesting question. And actually, this goes to the Amplify survey we're going to talk about in a little bit. When we ask that question, keep in mind, these are standard engagement surveys that companies are asking about all their employees, about all the issues that are going on in the organization. Typically, we only get the opportunity to ask one question, which is, do you have an apparent or non-apparent disability? Or sometimes we'll ask it as, do you have a visible or invisible disability? Asking it both ways. I don't know if someone has an invisible or a visible one. I can't tell that from that question because it's grouped together. However, I will tell you that most of the anecdotal data that I have is when people are disclosing their disability status within their organization, that they've given the opportunity to say that they belong to this group, we find that their data is not as negative as those who do not report their disability status. Now, the problem is that data is mostly anecdotal, and that's one of the reasons, we'll get to it at the end, we're going to be doing this Amplify survey that's coming up. But that's some of what I see a pattern there, that the more people are able to be themselves at work, and I mentioned this earlier, the more I can be authentic and the more I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not, the greater likelihood I'm going to be engaged and connected and committed to my organization. If I'm pretending that I don't have a disability, or if people don't know about that, people feel like that's their secret, they're not being as authentic at work, and that takes away from their experience. Maggie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you're exactly right that we don't know the specifics just because of the nature. Granted, this has been the last 10 years we've been studying this, so the movement of being loud and proud was just starting to happen. And so companies weren't asking disability-related questions. It's about the generalized experience. And that's what we know that we need. We need to ask better questions to get better answers so we can create better solutions. And that's what we're proposing. There's a question here about the amount of companies that have disabled employees in their leadership. We don't know that because we typically do ask, like, where do you sit within the organization? But Pete, I don't know if we have anything specifically about saying X percent are in leadership positions from the data we've studied so far.
Well, it's interesting you say that because that's going to be our next round of analyses that we're doing. Hopefully, if I can get time over the Christmas holiday, I'm going to be doing that analysis. So we should be seeing that soon. However, I do want to point out something very interesting. And again, this is more anecdotal. This wouldn't be considered research because I don't have enough data to support this. But anecdotally, I have two companies that I've done work with who have someone who's disabled, who's part of the senior leadership team, and has come out and disclosed their disability status in a loud and proud way, just the way Megan talked about it. And that has had a very positive impact on disability scores. It has a very strong impact. And we've seen this also in other types of diversity groups, right? If there's a senior leadership team member who's gay and they come out as gay, that has a real positive impact to people within the organization who are in the LGBT group. We also see that if we hire leaders who are Black, we'll have more positive scores for Black employees within the organization. And it's because they feel like, wow, you know what, they understand us. They're part of our group. So anecdotally, we're seeing that, but I have no reason to believe that that wouldn't be necessarily continue to be true.
Yeah.
In fact,
And
actually, if it's okay, okay.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say,
Meg.
we all know representation matters.
Right, it does. So if I move on to the next slide, this is going to be real interesting. So the big thing is, okay, Pete, we're talking about this, but can we make a difference? And the answer is absolutely. So this is just one company that I worked with a couple of years ago that their diversity leader came in and they had a very strong interest in disability status, which was wonderful for me. So I said, hey, why don't we start asking these questions on the survey? Can I ask that one question about, do you have an apparent or non-apparent disability? And give people the option to say either yes, no, or prefer not answer. By the way, that's the way you should ask the question. Don't just make it yes or no. Give them an option on selecting out. And what's interesting is we saw this pattern over time. The first year we studied with them, just like everyone else, they had a 6-point difference in overall engagement scores. But then they took it upon themselves to really take action on this. They really wanted to drive change. So in time 2, which was a year later, they did the same study again. They had increased their scores across the board because of some of the actions they took as a result of the survey. This is a fairly common experience that we would see. And they reduced that gap down from a 6-point gap to a 4-point gap. But they didn't want to just rest on that. They wanted to keep moving it forward. Then the following year, and then by the way, the following one was 2 years later, they took the survey again, they asked the question again, and now they reduced it down to a 3-point difference, right? I'm sure over time we're going to see that this difference gets smaller and smaller. And some of the things that they did is pretty much the things you would expect they would do. They had more programs around educating people on disability status. They did more in terms of recognizing if people needed to have different accommodations, or even not giving them accommodations, but letting them know, hey, listen, if you need an accommodation, we're here. This company in particular, one of the things they did a very strong program to get people to voluntarily identify themselves in their HRIS system as having a disability. And by the way, it also had the benefit, they had questions in there about sexual orientation, they had other questions in there about other diversity and inclusion questions like veteran status and whatnot. And they were able to up the population of data there. But if you work on this over time, you'll see a difference.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show you a little bit of focus, a little bit of attention can drive the needle immensely. So we wanted to share, because we get this a lot, what do companies do? What are companies doing to create inclusive cultures and create environments where people with disabilities feel valued? No surprise, Microsoft is one of the leaders in this space, and we share their story a lot because they're doing amazing things both internally for their employees and then also externally for their customers. So they really have put a stake in the ground of wanting to be a leader in this space, and they're widely regarded as a top-notch employer for people with disabilities. So those of you that don't know, Microsoft has a Chief Accessibility Officer, great lady by the name of Jenny Leigh-Fleury, who is doing amazing things, and she's got an incredible team that's focused on access and inclusion for employees with disabilities. They, of course, have an employee resource group. They really create an environment that is open and welcoming. They also have hackathons for their customers, where customers with disabilities will contact the company and say, hey, I'm struggling with this issue because of XYZ disability. So they host hackathons and bring coders in and spend 72 hours trying to solve those problems for people with disabilities, so they have better usage of their products and services. They also have a disability answer desk. So if you're not sure of the accessibility features or how to use them, you can call the answer desk and ask for help. They also have a dedicated page on the Microsoft site that is targeted just to accessibility and how to create accessible PDFs and how to make your PowerPoints more accessible, all of those things. So they're really providing free tools and resources to both companies and their customers as well. They also have, it used to be, we need to update this slide because it's now Neurodiversity Hiring Initiative. It started out as an autism-specific hiring initiative, but has expanded to a neurodiversity hiring initiative. So they're really committed across the board. You know, it also demonstrates buy-in at the highest level because Jenny reports directly to the CEO of Microsoft, which is also an interesting story about climate and culture. If you have not read the book, Hit Refresh by the CEO of Microsoft, it is definitely worth a read. It talks about his journey to radically change the culture of Microsoft from kind of a really competitive, cutthroat environment to one that was warm and welcoming and supportive. And he did this after he had a son with a significant disability, and he knew that his son would not succeed at Microsoft. So he wanted to create an environment where other people with disabilities could feel welcome, supported, and could succeed. So it's an interesting read if you get the chance to pick up the book. The next one that we really like is Northrop Grumman. They're doing amazingly well. We know the national average for disability disclosure is just about 4%. That has been ticking up since 2014. Excuse me. But Northrop Grumman is at almost 12% for disclosure. So that goes to show you an incredible inclusive culture that they're creating. They have 9 pillars that they say their business is supported on, and they make sure disability is woven across all of those 9 pillars. So they have mentors, they have buddies, they have coaches and managers that really focus on disability inclusion, and they have leaders with disabilities mentoring those who are junior with them with disabilities. Of course, they have a centralized accommodations process. They have a self-ID campaign that comes out twice a year. They have an employee resource group. So they're spending a lot of time talking about disability within their organization. So really sharing those stories and those inclusive culture components has made a difference in clearly their disability disclosure rate and also their retention. So those are just a couple that we really like. All right, we've been talking about Amplify a little bit, and so as Pete and I went through all of this data and looked at not only the results from the engagement surveys, but also those numbers we shared at the beginning, that only 4% of companies are investigating disability as a diversity segment, we saw an incredible opportunity to create a climate and culture survey that was focused on disability. We also know that engagement surveys are now becoming more segmented. Over the last 2 years, we have had the Me Too movement, George Floyd, Asian hate, all of these things that have really shaken up our world, and companies are realizing one size doesn't fit all, and I need to better understand the diversity of our employee population and how they are being impacted and how we can support them better. So as this move to segmented surveys is happening, we knew there was an opportunity to bring disability into that conversation. So Amplify will not take the place of your large strategic survey that happens once a year or every other year. It will be more of a pulse survey. We're going to run this as a cohort starting February 14th through March 4th, so it will be up and running for 3 weeks. We will, of course, touch on the typical engagement items of diversity, equity, leadership, climate culture, achievement, all of those things. But then we're also going to ask disability inclusion specific questions. What also makes this survey unique is that we're going to survey both people with disabilities and people without disabilities. So the first 35 or so questions, we're still tinkering a little bit on the exact number, will be the same. And then the last 15 will be different based on how you answered a question at the top of the survey. Are you a person with a disability? And we'll give some definitions of that. Or are you an advocate, an ally, or a parent of someone with a disability? So the questions will, if you say, yes, I'm a person with a disability, you'll get questions around the accommodations process. Do you feel comfortable disclosing your disability at work? Have you disclosed your disability at work? Are you happy that you disclosed, or do you regret disclosing? We'll talk about remote work environments. We'll talk about workplace safety, since that's a new topic because of the pandemic, but not a new topic typically for people with disabilities. I know that has been a long-going conversation, whether it's evacuation or shelter in place. You know, are people with disabilities able to feel that level of safety that many of those without disabilities feel? And if you're a person who's an advocate or an ally, parent, you'll get questions around your leadership. I see my leaders talking about disability inclusion in the same way they do other diversity initiatives. I see my colleagues with disabilities treated with dignity and respect. I see leaders with disabilities within my organization. So still disability-related questions, but more the nuance of what are you seeing? What are the elements of the culture? So it will give us the lived experience of employees with disability, and then the perceptions of those without disability. So it'll give you that nice kind of holistic view of what's happening within the organization. So Pete, you want to talk a little bit about how the survey rolls out and what people get?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we've designed the survey to be as easily implemented as possible. So it's quite simple. We send, once you register for it, we'll send a unique link for everyone in the organization to take the survey. We'll be able to put together a full data set so you could view and do different cuts of the entire organization and find out where there might be pockets. We'll be giving you a summary of the findings in a shareable report. And then what we'll also do is give you a 1 hour of consultation, and this is included as part of it. We could do a much deeper dive and, you know, spend a lot more time with this, but we try to give you at least, you know, a 1 hour consultation just to give you the big picture, but also be able to interpret the results within the context. And sometimes that's the hardest thing. You know, Meg and I have been doing this for the past 10 or 15 years, right? We know when something is a little astray or right on target, and we'll be able to speak to that. And like I said, you'll be able to benchmark against our data set, and we have a tremendously large data set, probably one of the best in the business. And then, you know, should you want anything beyond that, you could partner with either me or Meg to do any additional work that you see for this. You know, you could figure out what else you need in your program to really drive change in that. But it's, again, that's an optional thing. My primary goal really is to collect these data, really figure out for your organization, what are you guys doing well and where there are opportunity areas. And then me personally, one of the reasons I want to do this is there's a number of questions that I get asked on a regular basis, which is like, you know, do you see a difference between those people who've disclosed and those people who have not? Do you see a difference between invisible disabilities and visible disabilities? There's so many questions that I haven't been able to tap that I really would like to get to the bottom of.
Intersectionality comes up a lot.
But again, Matt, you cut out.
Oh, sorry. The intersectionality comes up a lot.
Absolutely. And this data will allow us to do that.
Absolutely. So we have about 9 minutes left. So Luke, I don't know if you can unmute folks, or you just want people sending questions in the chat still, but we're ready to take some questions or get some comments or thoughts from folks. Let's hear what you're thinking about.
Yes, please. And as a reminder, you can send questions at any time by using the Q&A box to the left of the presentation screen. It's the one with the question mark. Just press that button and you'll get a pop-up box where you can type in your question and then just press enter to send it.
Yeah. While we're waiting for that, I did want to add something. Someone responded to the question about sample size. And one thing I want to be real critical about is my normative data isn't sample data. In other words, I don't go into a company of 10,000 people and get 100 people to respond to the survey. When I have a company of 10,000 people, my average response rate is 82%. So I'm getting 82% of that company of 10,000 people or 8,200 people. What I have found is sample data is good for getting a rough estimate. So sometimes I'll do that with a client if they're interested. Hey, Pete, I just want to get a feel for what's going on. I'm like, okay, let's do a sample survey. But for these surveys, these are employee census surveys where we include and invite the entire organization, and then everyone is therefore responding to that survey. That's a real important distinction.
Yeah, it's a good point. I know we answered a lot of questions during the session, so you know, certainly happy to answer more. You can ask an anonymous question, as we saw earlier, so if you're not sure you want to ask it, but want to put it out there, feel free to do so. If not, then we can give everybody 7 minutes back in your day. Well, it looks like everybody's getting ready to sign up for Amplify. That's what's happening. So,
there you go.
And to that point, if you want more information about Amplify, we do have a fact sheet on it. Someone says it was great. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Patty. I can send you the fact sheet, and we also have a frequently asked questions document. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me directly. You can, again, my email is meg@globaldisabilityinclusion.com, or Anne, who is our business operations manager, and it's ANNE @globaldisabilityinclusion.com. Either one will get you what you need. Here's a question. I just wonder how many companies really are interested in disability inclusion? Yeah, as you saw at the beginning, only 4% of companies are interested in disability inclusion. So it's our hope that shining the spotlight on the disparity against people with disabilities and those without companies will become more interested, because people don't know what they don't know. So if you start sharing with them the gaps that exist, and we know this happens in other diversity groups, when you start talking about the gaps in equity and inclusion, companies begin to pay attention. So we're hoping more and more companies get interested in disability inclusion because we have been sharing this data far and wide.
Yep. And I do want to point out, and this is really critical, since the Section 503 laws have come out, we've seen a tick up across the board, not just for companies that are government contractors, which is what that regulation was really about, but companies in general are moving in that direction. Prior to 2014, Meg? 2015? Prior to that, it was harder for us to get companies to ask these questions because the lawyers didn't want to put the company at risk, and they felt like, wait, if we do this and we see there's a difference here between those with disabilities and those without, then it therefore becomes discoverable. And if it's discoverable, it's going to put us in legal peril, perhaps. But the tides are really turning on that, and a lot of companies now are seeing that this is an opportunity to avoid the problem before it happens, rather than wait and fix it after the fact. And that's been a fantastic finding. Also, as you know, some of the social injustices of 2020 were going on, there's been a greater interest in disability inclusion as part of the entire world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're looking for all of those differences. So we do see that the tides are really changing on this. Granted, not as quickly as Meg and I would like, but at least they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, most definitely. There's definitely more conversations about it, and everything starts with those conversations. But we're ready for folks to take some action, and we think the Amplify survey is a great way for folks to get engaged, for companies to begin to understand what's happening within their four walls, and to create change around it. So we're really excited. So those of you that are with companies or have connections to companies, please encourage them to take part. It's a way to get them involved and to really elevate the conversation about disability inclusion within your organization. Here's someone. I just wonder how many of them we did. How can we continue to help in your efforts? Oh, Jim, thank you. I appreciate it. If you want to send companies to, sign up for the Amplify survey, pass information along, that would be great. Just continue to educate people on disability inclusion and the fact that, people with disabilities are valued members of our communities and our workplaces, and we need to do better about treating them that way.
Yep.
All right, we got 2 minutes left. If there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and let you guys finish your day. All right,
Wonderful.
Luke, I
Thank
think
you, everyone.
that's it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate you, and everybody have a great holiday season. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for joining us.
Thank
Luke,
you very
we'll turn
much,
it back over
everyone,
to you.
and thank you, Meg. This concludes today's Global Disability Inclusion webinar. On behalf of our speakers, thank you for attending.